Hello, this video is set up to explain to you a little bit about carbohydrates as a biomolecule. If you remember from the chart that we looked at in the biomolecules video, there are a few things to talk about with carbohydrates. Again, since we talked about this one before, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but the carbohydrates are, of course, the polymer group we're talking about. Monosaccharides are the monomer that make up that polymer, and we'll see there's actually different levels to carbohydrates, which we'll go through in a minute. Some of the important things that they're used for, they're used to build cell membranes. And remember, this is important for the cell membrane in order to identify the cell. So the carbohydrate markers are one of the ways that your immune system identifies things as being from your body. That it can also identify other things as being foreign. And then things like glucose are used as quick energy for the cell. We'll talk in a minute about some other forms of carbohydrates that are stored in your cells, and then energy can be released over a period of time if you need it. As far as some food sources go, most of these are common sense: pastas, breads, fruits, and vegetables. A few examples: glucose, this is the simplest of the sugars. Fructose is also pretty simple. Lactose is the sugar that's found in milk. And then cellulose is the material that's found in the cell wall of like plant cells and fungi. If we look at our picture here, this gives you an example of some carbohydrates. Keep in mind, some of the things in this picture will contain proteins. For example, like milk. Milk has protein in it, milk has fat in it, but milk also has carbohydrates. So lactose is the sugar that's in milk. So just because something's represented on here doesn't mean it's purely carbohydrates. It just means that there's carbohydrates in it. But the common things that we think of are things like breads, of course, fruits, your vegetables, all of those things have the carbohydrates in it that you need in order to use for energy. What we're talking about here is just breaking down the different saccharide groups, and these are the things that compose carbohydrates. There's three major groups of these. We have mono, di, and polysaccharides. What a monosaccharide tells you is that there's only one saccharide molecule. So prefix mono tells us one, so there's only one single saccharide here. Something like this would be glucose or fructose, like very, very simple, small sugars. Disaccharides are two saccharides bonded together, so prefix di tells us two. Things like sucrose and lactose apply here, so like the sugar found in a lot of fruits, because there's sucrose and fructose usually found in fruits. And then lactose, obviously, the sugar that's found in milk would be a disaccharide. The one that gets a little tricky is polysaccharides, and a prefix poly tells us many, so you think of like polymer made up of many smaller monomers. Well, in this case, a polysaccharide is anything that is more than 2. So it could be 3, it could be 15, it could be any number. We don't really break things down into like trisaccharides. Anything more than 2 falls into this poly category. These are generally really complicated things like starches and glycogen, which we'll talk more about in a second. This picture is relatively simple. We won't spend a ton of time on this one. Just some examples, again, of the monosaccharides and disaccharides. So as I mentioned before, glucose and fructose are two great examples for monosaccharides, very small, simple sugars. Disaccharides, like the lactose found in milk, and the sucrose that's found in some fruits and other natural sources. To talk about some of the polysaccharides, there are three major ones here. Things like starch are very complicated. They're usually found in things like vegetables that are used to store energy. So if you think of potatoes, potatoes have a large amount of starch in them. It's a tuber, it's a root that you're actually eating there, and the whole purpose of that root is to store energy for the plant. So starches are how plants really store a lot of their long-term energy. Glycogen is similar in structure, as you can see, but it has more of these little tiny branches on it. Glycogen is the sugar that's stored in your muscle cells. So glycogen is used for relatively stable long-term storage. When your cell needs to release energy, glucose molecules are actually broken off of here, and they're used. That's why it has all of these little branches sort of sticking off of it. It'll break those off and use them for energy when your cell needs them. We talked about respiration earlier. That's the process where these things are being used. So that's the sugar that fuels respiration. A lot of that is coming from glycogen. And then the last one is cellulose. This is what's making up the cell wall in plant cells. and it's a very, very rigid, structured molecule. You can see this one has much more structure than the glycogen and the starch do, and that's part of what lends some of that rigidity and structure to plant cells. So the main thing with carbohydrates is just to know the different groups that compose them, the different monomer groups. As long as you're comfortable with monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, you pretty much have this one figured out. So as always, I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Make sure you answer the questions when you're finished, and we'll talk about this one more in class tomorrow. Thank you.